آله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين وخذ بأيدينا إليك أخذ الكرام عليك يا رب العالمين. ثم أما بعد. Alhamdulillah. Inshallah everyone can hear me, and we'll make a start. If people can hear and see me, inshallah. Okay, alhamdulillah. Inshallah everyone's well, and so we've reached Juz 28, so nearing the end, inshallah. And alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept all of this, and a really big thank you. And also I think this is my last session with you guys, so I just really appreciate people who've been with us throughout, and even those who've been catching up later, inshallah. It's a really big deal to be able to do that in Ramadan with the rest of the effort of the month and so on. So alhamdulillah. So Juz 28, it's we've titled the core theme here, Sacred Connections, Elements of a Prophetic Community. This is quite a difficult one. I mentioned this previously too. As we start working through the latter part of the ajza of the Quran, the surahs become more greater in quantity, right? So the quantity of surahs per juz become larger, and so to bind down the juz becomes difficult, whereas the themes of the surahs themselves are no doubt clear, and there's conceptual connections. So one of the things that we see with Juz 28 is that it begins to it's one of those ajza where the surahs now are really multiplying in numbers. So we have 9 surahs, and what's interesting about this juz is that all 9 surahs, according to the majoritarian view, so there's some khilaf about Surah As-Saff and parts of other surahs too, but the majoritarian view of the Mufassirin is that they're all Madani surahs. They're all Madani surahs. And it's the last set of Madani surahs in this combined fashion, right? So it's the last unified set of Madani surahs in the Quran. And then from just 29 onwards, we have Meccan surahs primarily. And so Juz 28 consists of 9 surahs, beginning with Al-Mujadila or Al-Mujadala, and also there's khilaf about some of the names there, as we'll see, like Al-Mumtahina, Al-Mumtahana, and there's Mujadila, Mujadala. The scholars have differed about the actual dabt with the name, or are they more than one name? So we have 9 surahs in the in this Juz 28, and 4 of these 9 surahs are from a family of surahs that are known as the Musabbihat, which we don't have time to get into, but I mentioned this previously, that you have the family of the Hawamim surahs, right? Those surahs that begin with the Hamim. And then like from the 11th juz, you have the family of the Alif Lam Ra surahs, right? Surah Yusuf, Surah Al-Ra'd, Surah Al-Nahl, up to Surah Al-Nahl. So you have the Alif Lam Ra surahs, and then you have the surahs that begin with praise, and we spoke about them, that begin with Alhamdulillah in the last session. So here we have the family of the Musabbihat, which may be rendered the glorifiers. So each one of, and some scholars say there's 6, others say there's 7. 4 of them are inside this juz, not consecutively, with a surah in between. They're broken apart. 2 of them come together and the other 2 are broken apart, but the Musabbihat begin with Al-Hadid. So the last surah of Juz 27, Surah Al-Hadid, that's where the Musabbihat begin. And the Musabbihat basically meaning what? Meaning that they begin with a glorification of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or a command to glorify, right? And other scholars even say that the Musabbihat begin further back in Juz 15 with Surah Al-Isra, which is Subhanalladhi Asra, with the word Subhan. So they begin with Subhana, Sabbaha, Yusabbihu lillahi ma fi samawati wa ma fi al-ard, and so on. They begin with some formula of glorification of Allah, using the word Sabbaha, Yusabbihu, Subhan, Sabbih ismi rabbikal a'la, which is the last one. And so you have this family of surahs. 4 of them are inside this, and they're a very special set of surahs, very close to the heart of the Prophet ﷺ, if that may be said about any particular surah. But this family of surahs, in one riwayah of Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, she said that the Prophet ﷺ would not retire to bed unless he had recited all 6 of them. And so he would recite the entire family of the Musabbihat, alayhi salawatullah. Amongst them is Surah Al-Hashr, which we're going to look at. And the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith, which is reported by many of Al-Bazzar, I believe, and many of the Mufassirin, Ibn Kathir mentions in his tafsir, there's a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said that inside the Musabbihat, hidden Remember what we said about the idea, the concept of hiding in the previous lesson? But hidden inside the musabbihat is a verse that's greater. خَيْرٌ مِنْ أَلْفِ آيَةٍ, the Prophet ﷺ said. In the midst of the musabbihat is a single verse that's greater than 1,000 verses. And some of the scholars have it down to being the last ayah of Surah Al-Hashr. Right, so which is going to be one of the surahs that we encounter. Now, because the surahs are so many, it's going to be very difficult to do what we've done previously, which is look at each surah individually. So I'm going to, and also because I'm trying to highlight a particular set of connections inside the juz, which relates to the Madani period of the Prophet ﷺ's life. And as we said, these surahs are mid to late Madani, most of them. All 9 of them, mid to late Madani. So you have surahs from the 5th year, you have surahs from the 6th year post Hudaybiyah, and then you have surahs later than that. So we're talking about the Muslims, they're at a very evolved state of in terms of civilizational and communal establishment, right? So in terms of being a community and in terms of being a nation, so to speak, they're very established, and it's a long way now into the prophetic dispensation, right? So, and even in Medina now, it's coming to the later period of the Medinan period, of the Medinan epoch of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. So it's very interesting to see, as we've mentioned with some of the Meccan surahs previously, but it's very interesting now to see the other end, right? Which is, what are the Sahaba radiallahu anhu being schooled in, and what are they being inculcated at this stage in the progress and in the evolution and the unfolding of prophecy, right? What is it now that they're being called unto? And one of the highlights of this juz, and you'll see, for those of you who already read the juz, or those of you who are going to read inshallah tonight or tomorrow, what you'll see is that all 9 surahs are essentially snippets from the lives of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And you also notice with these surahs that the examples also, the Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the choice of examples also now shifts to the prophetic epoch itself. So the examples that are given, the parables that are cited, the narratives that are related are now from the prophetic epoch, from the prophetic period itself, from the lives of the Sahaba. And so we have a conversation about the Ansar. We have parables from the house of the Prophet ﷺ, very personal narratives, very personal stories from inside the house of prophecy itself. The Prophet ﷺ vis-a-vis his wives, his engagement with the people of his household, alayhi salawatullah, and the Sahaba who are involved with him, ﷺ, and so on. So it's a major shift in terms of themes that are going to be touched on. But what we see, one of the things that I wanted to point out was, if you read this, and this is why it's very interesting, because the seerah, according to our scholars, the seerah is one of the most primary resources in terms of tafsir of the Quran, the hadith and the seerah literature. Like the first point of call, the first point of return in terms of explaining, understanding context, is to go back to seerah. And some of the most interesting works that have been done recently, especially in the last 50-60 years, have been books of seerah that are based on the Quran itself. Like one of the greatest books is by Muhammad Abu Shahba, or Shahba, one of the great Egyptian Azhari scholars, who has a book on the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ in the light of the Quran. So it's literally going through the chapter by chapter of the Quran, but it's extrapolating the Prophet ﷺ seerah from the themes that are being addressed inside the Quran. So here we begin to see that. We begin to see a very close, focused, zoomed in view of Medina al-Munawwara itself, and of the community of Muslims. And the examples are from that community itself. And so we're going to go through each surah and look at some of the key themes, and inshallah, if there's time, and I'm sure there will be, just to look at least verses from 1 or 2 surahs, right? But I'm going to just present a conceptual overview of all 9 surahs, so we see how they relate to this concept. And what I want us to appreciate in this lesson, inshallah, the takeaway from this lesson, more so than any individual verses or passages from the Quran, it's the conceptual connection, right? How the set of surahs moves conceptually and thematically one on from the other in terms of progress and evolution of a community, of the growth of community. And so the issues that are now going to be moved on to in terms of discussion in these surahs are issues of loyalty, issues of community, issues of fraternity, in terms of how is it that flourishing, thriving Muslim communities are established, and what are the principles or the basis for those communities, right? What are the theoretical values or theoretical principles and basis upon which flourishing, thriving communities are established? And so right from the beginning, Surah Al-Mujadila, Mujadala, which is the first surah in the Juz, consisting of 22 verses, you have a lot of these themes now that begin to be addressed. From the very beginning, one of the things that we see is this idea of Allah orientation or God orientation, right? So this is highlighted inside this surah immediately, Surah Al-Mujadila. In fact, from the very beginning, what we see is that the narrative itself is of a woman, Khawla bin Sa'laba radiallahu anha, the famous story of the woman who comes and complains about her husband. And each one of these, I mean, it's very tempting. Each one of these surahs is there's a narrative, a story from inside the depth of Medinan society. So it actually gives you a window into how society is functioning. Like in Al-Mujadila here, what we see is a window into how the women of Medina al-Munawwara relate to the prophetic being in his prophetic capacity, in his office of prophecy. So we have, for example, Khawla bin Sa'laba, and like I said, it's very tempting to go into each story, but that would really take us really beyond the scope here. But in Al-Mujadila, we have Khawla bin Sa'laba, the famous story of the woman who comes to the Prophet ﷺ to complain about her husband, right? And what's interesting is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions her and he says that she came to the Prophet ﷺ, but her complaint was to God about her mistreatment, a particular legal issue of zihar, right? That was popular in pre-Islamic Jahili custom. So but one of the things that we take from this is how the people of Medina al-Munawwara, including the women of Medina, how their orientation, that they were God orientated, right? Meaning that they were, in terms of the way that they configured and the way that they understood the issues of their lives, it was through directing themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so in this surah, one of the things that you have a constant mentioning of, in the surah consists of 22 verses, and the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the word Allah, is mentioned at least once in every ayah. And Imam al-Biqai radiallahu anh, the author of Nadm al-Durar, he draws our attention to this, right? The fact that the name of Allah is constantly being repeated in an apparently mundane legal matter in which a woman is complaining about a domestic situation. And the repetition, he says, of the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is indicative of the fact that there is nothing mundane in the community of believers. Everything is orientated towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The believer directs himself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even in the most apparently mundane or profane domestic matter. And so what she does is she makes recourse to the Prophet ﷺ immediately as soon as the problem takes place. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is where the juz begins, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ فِي زَوْجِهَا وَتَشْتَكِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears her and sends Jibreel alayhi salam in response to her domestic complaint to the Prophet ﷺ. And Khawla bin Sa'laba is from one of the forerunners of the women of the Sahaba radiallahu anhunna in Medina Munawwara. She's part of the Shura, the council of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh. And there's a famous story where Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu would even stop for her in the streets. Once Sayyidina Umar was as caliph, he is the Khalifa, he's walking in the street and an old woman approaches him and she says, Ta'ala ya Umair. She doesn't even call him Amir al-Mu'mineen, she doesn't call him Umar. Umair is like a diminutive. It's like, come here, little Umar, right? And so she calls him over, and Sayyidina Umar stops, and he tells his servant to move to the side, and he goes and stands with this woman in the middle of the street as the caliph of the Muslims, right? And as the leader of a growing empire, Sayyidina Umar, most of the Muslim world that we know to be the Muslim world is conquered, is attained in the time of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh. So Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh says, he stops and listens to her, and then his slave asks him later, why did you stop for this old woman? She should have come to you in the council, or it was inappropriate for the Amir al-Mu'mineen to stop in the streets. And he said, Sayyidina Umar said, this is a woman that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this was Khawla. Do you know this is Khawla? This is a woman that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears and responds to from above 7 heavens. Umar can only stop and listen to this woman, right? And so that's how he deals with her. Another thing that we see in this surah is the principle of radical adherence to the law, right? Radical adherence to the law. What does this mean? this idea that there must be healthy, sound Muslim communities. There must be an adherence to the law in the outward law, the Sharia. There must be a strict, radical adherence to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the teaching. And the reason for that is because it's the adherence to the Sharia which renders individuals sound. Right? The soundness of the individual at every degree of function, at the level of the mind, at the level of the body, the regulation of the body, at the level of the heart, the regulation of one's internal state and one's spiritual affairs, at the level of the intellect and the regulation of thoughts and the regulation of ideologies and mindsets and cognitive frames. All of the regulation of these different tiers of human function are only accomplished through the sacred law, through the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so in adhering to the law, we have the emergence of sound individuals. And with the emergence of sound individuals, in groups, you have the appearance of sound communities. And so the surah here emphasizes very strongly, and in fact, one of the things that you find in the surah is a constant challenge to those who oppose the law. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at least 3 times in the 22 verses, there is an explicit challenge to those يَتَحَادُّونَ تَحَادَّ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes mention of those people who oppose Allah and the Messenger. In other words, who contravene sacred law in the way that Allah intends for it to be established, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we have the mentioning at the end, inshallah, which we'll look at the relevant verse, is the rooting of faith inside the hearts and the minds of the believers. And how faith is etched inside the realities of these people. And so these features that have been mentioned here are the precursors to how we establish prophetic communities. Prophetic communities are established when we establish individuals that are deeply rooted, embedded in the soil of faith, that adhere to the law inwardly, outwardly, and that regulate their beings on the basis of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sacred law. And those who are in their general approach, their orientation, the orientation of their being, the approach, the attitudes of their being, they are oriented towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the precursors. In the absence of such features, the presence of healthy, wholesome, organic, sound Muslim communities is a mere dream. It's tamanni ala Allah. It's like far-fetched, vain hopes that don't have the groundwork and don't have the basis to actualize, to be realized in extramental reality, to actually exist out there, right? That's the first. This moves on to then Surah Al-Hashr. And Surah Al-Hashr now is going to be a more microscopic, it's like a zoom in. Now it zooms in to the Sahaba themselves. And as we know, the Sahaba, the community of Medina al-Munawwara, the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they're comprised of the Muhajirun and the Ansar. And so what we have in Surah Al-Hashr, along with Surah Al-Hashr, also known as Surah Banu Nadir, right? Because it's a reference to the Jewish tribe that was expelled. It's actually called Hashr because of their expulsion. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here now turns in to look at the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and the qualities of the Sahaba that rendered them the most glorious and the most great and the most magnanimous generation of believers to ever walk the face of the earth, including the nations of previous prophets, right? So all communities of prophets and all communities that received prophetic dispensation, it was these men and women, Sahaba radiallahu anhum, that are metaphysically and theologically considered to be the greatest and the most glorious generation of people who believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to walk on the face of the earth. What was it that rendered them thus? What made them such people? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now is going to speak about the qualities of the Muhajirin, and He speaks about the qualities of the Ansar. He speaks about the principle of sacrifice. From verse 9 onwards, He speaks about the first, and in verse 9 He speaks about, or verse 8 rather, He speaks about the Muhajirin and how they sacrificed and they abandoned everything that they had. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls them fuqara. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls them fuqara, that they abandoned their wealth. Why? For the nusra, to give victory and to give succor and to give assistance and support to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then He speaks about loyalty. This is now shifting into verse 10, where He speaks about the Ansar radiallahu anhum, and He speaks about the principle of loyalty, which is at the heart of community, right? Communities that are bereft of loyalty are just the shell without the kernel. Right? There's no substance. These are forms without matter. These are people who share physical space, but they don't share they don't share spiritual space, that are distant, which is the hallmark of hypocrisy. Right? The very hallmark of hypocrisy is to be physically together, but to be distant and to be rent asunder and to be dispersed in one's spiritual reality. And so Allah speaks about loyalty. He speaks about the altruism of the muhajirin. He speaks about sincerity. One of the interesting things that Allah drew our attention to is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the issue of continuity. وَالَّذِينَ جَاءُوا مِن بَعْدِهِمْ. Right? Those who come after the generation of the Sahaba. And Ibn Ajiba rahmatullah alayhi in his tafsir, he says, هذه الآية استوعبت كل مؤمن إلى يوم القيامة. Right? Ibn Ajiba says, this verse of the Quran, verse 12 of Surah Al-Hashr, he says this verse encompasses every believer until Yawm al-Qiyamah. Right? That's the one of the strongest opinion with the Mufassirin. In fact, Ibn Qurtubi and Ibn Kathir make reference to it. So it's the idea of continuity, the idea that that every subsequent generation of believers is part of a continuum of the previous generation, which is the idea of tradition. Right? Tradition meaning in the classical, in the Latin term meaning to hand down. Right? The idea of community without continuity is going to perish. Communities without continuity perish. Those people who are disconnected and severed from their forefathers and the Salaf, there's no way forward. Right? There's no way forward. And the way that one moves forward is to understand where the previous people reached and where they stopped. So that's what it means to receive, and that's what makes communities living communities, because they're part of an unbroken chain, so to speak, of communal prophetic dispensation that's been passed down without break, without lacunas, without gaps. And so this is the idea of continuity, where the people who come after, وَالَّذِينَ جَاءُوا مِن بَعْدِهِمْ, they make du'as for the people who came before, right? رَبَّنَا اغْفِرْ لَنَا وَلِإِخْوَانِنَا الَّذِينَ سَبَقُونَا بِالْإِيمَانِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the principle of continuity in establishing community. This shifts then onto Surah Al-Mumtahina. Surah Al-Mumtahina is, or Mumtahina meaning the tester, consisting of 13 verses. Surah Al-Mumtahina is a very powerful surah. Right? What is the base? Then it takes its name from the women who would migrate to the Prophet ﷺ in Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructs him and the Sahaba to test them, to test their loyalties before taking their allegiances. Right? But what Surah Al-Mumtahina does is that it delineates very clearly, it delineates the allegiances and the associations and the affections of the believer with other nations. Right? And the implication thereby is that communities that don't have their allegiances and affections and associations and alliances clearly established, they don't know where true friendship and true wala, true wilaya, true affection and association lies, these communities are bound to perish because their identities become lost. The identities become lost. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also speaks about the principle of the other. And by the other, we mean anybody who's not a Muslim, communities of non-Muslims. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about how the believing communities associate with disbelieving or non-Muslim communities, right? What's the basis of the association? And can there be a wilaya? Can there be a befriending or an alliance, so to speak? A religious alliance is speaking about, right? So we're not speaking about communal or social alliances or political alliances, but this is speaking about the idea of religious alliances. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sets it very clear that this is impossible for the believers, and amongst the believers, true believers, people of this nature won't be found. People whose affection and alliances and allegiances are not clear. So again, referring back to the principle of loyalty, and a lot of these surahs, they're going to share similar themes. There's going to be themes that repeat themselves very frequently. In fact, there's full ayahs that are almost verbatim from other surahs, from within the 9. Right? So there's like Surah Al-Talaq has verses that are identical to Surah Al-Tahrim. Surah Al-Taghabun and Munafiqun, this is why we've grouped them. We'll see inshallah. So Surah Al-Mumtahina speaks about the principle of loyalty and the principle of allegiance. Right? And then inside the establishment of communal allegiances and affections between the believers, where then do other communities outside the Muslim community stand in regard to that? And then this moves on to Surah Al-Saf. And if, like what we mentioned that point, look at the conceptual connections. Surah Al-Mujadila, the precursors to community. Surah Al-Hashr, the archetypal features of what enables communitarian connection, right? What allows for communal connections? What makes community sacred, right? It's these virtues and these ethical foundations that are divinely ordained. They render mere community sacred community, right? They render friendship sacred friendship. They render societies sacred societies, because they are now in line. They are aligned with prophetic teaching. And the Surah Al-Mumtahina says, here are your allegiances. Here are the people you should ally with. Here are how you engage with other people. And then it says, once your allegiances and your loyalties are established, and once you've pledged allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ to the death, now it's time to enter the battle. And Surah Al-Saf now is a call to war, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls to war, and He calls for believers to rise and to stand for truth. Right? And so in Surah Al-Saf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in fact, He says He loves, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ صَفًّا كَأَنَّهُمْ بُنْيَانٌ مَرْصُوصٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Allah loves amongst the people, and this is the many verses in the Quran that you can trace about the types of qualities and features of people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are beloved to Him. But He says amongst the things that are beloved to Him, Jalla Thana'u, are those who rise in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and fight saffan, in ranks, i.e. unified, reinforcing the principle of fraternity, of connection. They fight in ranks كَأَنَّهُمْ بُنْيَانٌ مَرْصُوصٌ, as though they are an impregnable structure, as though they are a bunyan marsus, as though they are a building that cannot be broken down, right? That has been firmly tied together. And so that's if you look at that logically, sequentially, precursors onto the qualities and features of community, onto a delineation of allegiance and of loyalty, and then onto now, once those are established, those alliances and those allegiances are established, now what to do with them. The outward manifestation of true loyalty is that then one struggles against those who are impeding the path of the truth that one stands for, right? To struggle against them and to rise against them in jihad. And there's many forms of jihad that are being referred to. In fact, inside the surah itself, there's a reference to warfare, a reference to martial combat, also as well as a reference to other types of jihad. This moves then on to Surah Al-Jumu'ah. Surah Al-Jumu'ah is a reinforcing of Surah Al-Saf. Right? Remember we spoke about these mirror or twin surahs, right? Surah Al-Jumu'ah and Surah Al-Saf. Surah Al-Jumu'ah is a reinforcement of what's been stated. It's what's been stated already in Surah Al-Saf, but on a different level. Right, so in Surah Al-Saf, it was that we rank in the formation of in battle formation, right? That the believers gather in battle formation, and now they defend the truth that they stand for, and they take the truth of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to other nations and to other peoples. In Surah Al-Jumu'ah now, it's a more personal affair to the believers. But the scholars, Mufassirin, they point out that one of the reasons, apart from the obvious reason, which is that Surah Al-Jumu'ah actually makes a mention of Surah Al-Jumu'ah in the end. إِذَا نُودِيَ لِلصَّلَاةِ مِنْ يَوْمِ الْجُمُعَةِ فَاسْعَوْا إِلَىٰ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Allah says that when the call is made for the Salat Al-Jumu'ah, then hasten, rush, rise to God's remembrance. وَذَرُوا الْبَيْعَ, and leave aside your commerce, your merchandise, your businesses. But apart from that, Jama'ah is to gather oneself. Right? It's the act of gathering oneself. Jama'ah in Arabic is to gather, is to bring together, is to coalesce, right? And so what the Mufassirin point out that the reason why the surah is called Jumu'ah, apart from the obvious reference, is because Jumu'ah is just one in many examples of religious duties in which one has to abandon the dunya and rise to fulfill the obligation that's sent down upon one from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Is to rise to fulfill one's obligation. In other words, Jumu'ah is to gather yourself at every level. gather oneself intellectually, gather oneself physically, gather oneself socially and communally, gather oneself domestically at the level of the family unit. It's the act of gathering oneself in order to rise, then to then fulfill one's religious duty, right? So Surah Al-Jumu'ah is an example of that. Jumu'ah is an example of, it's in the middle of the day. It's made fard by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's in the middle of your trade day, your work day, or your day at uni. You're in the middle of a lecture. You're in the middle of business. You're in the middle of selling some goods. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in the midst of your day-to-day grind, in the midst of your acquisition of your livelihood, when the call to prayer is called, dharul bay'ah, abandon it. Abandon all commerce. Abandon all merchandise, all business. Abandon everything that you're engaged in, and now hasten to the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That being a mirror, that being a mere manifestation, a reflection of the believer state of being. Because the believer state of being is that whether it's Jum'ah or any other religious obligation, right? Whether it's the obligation of teaching your children, whether it's the obligation of raising your family, whether it's the obligation of going out and serving the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, whether it's the obligation of raising funds for those in need, whatever the obligation might be, when the call comes, the believer gathers all their faculties and is at the gates of service to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The believer by his nature is gathered in terms of his faculties and in terms of her abilities, and makes them available to the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the point here. And then Surah Al-Jumu'ah also indicates, also makes a mention of a very key feature of Muslim community, which is a rejection of dunya, a rejection at the level of heart. Right? It's a rejection of the lowly dimension of the world, the dunya, which has a lowly dimension, which is everything that distracts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it makes a mention of the dunya at the end. And the reason why it does that is because of the famous instant where the Prophet ﷺ is giving the khutbah and the Sahaba, it's a time of drought in Medina al-Munawwara, and the Sahaba have been starving for weeks. Their children are struggling, and what happens is a caravan of a merchant, famous merchant in Medina. That caravan goes by, and it goes outside the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Sahaba, they see the caravan, they see the elephants coming, and they're kind of loaded with goods from Syria and from other places and things that they've been waiting for, and the Sahaba just abandon the khutbah, right? They just leave the khutbah. I mean, can you imagine that? Like just to imagine that for a second, just like picture that inside your minds. Tabarakallah, right? The Prophet ﷺ is giving khutbah, and the Prophet ﷺ, and this is not early days now. We're way into Medina al-Munawwara, and the Prophet ﷺ is giving khutbah, and according to a narration, only 17 people remain sitting amongst the Sahaba. In one narration, only 10 people. In another narration, 12 people, and that's the strongest. Only 12 people remain. The 10 who were guaranteed Jannah, Ashara Mubashara, the 10 given good news of Jannah, Sayyidina Bilal and Sayyidina Abdullah bin Mas'ud. That's it, 12 people. And the rest abandon and they go out. And so it's in light of that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the lahu and the tijara that the dunya calls you to has no good in it. Good is in the grace of God, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ends this surah by indicating that at the level of community, at the level of a nation, of a group of believers, if our attachments lie with the world, then the communities will perish, right? Sacredity, godliness from our communities, prophetic orientation from the community will disappear. And then that goes on to Surah Al-Munafiqun. Surah Al-Munafiqun and Surah Al-Taghabun, they are a pair. And the two surahs now, after telling us what the features of a community are, after spelling out, delineating what a community consists of, what are its precursors, how is it to be established, what are the features of those inside such communities, thriving Muslim communities, after spelling out all of this, then now it tells us what is the antidote, what is the antithesis, right? What's the nemesis of community, i.e. what destroys community. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes mention of a very important feature here, very important. And there's only two things, because in the previous, like in Surah Al-Saf and Surah Al-Mumtahina, Allah told us about the outward enemies. Allah spoke about the apparent enemies that are clear, right? Your allegiances are here, they stand in opposition to your allegiances. After doing this, in Surah Al-Munafiqun and Taghabun, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the silent destroyers of community. And He highlights two, the fitna of family and the fitna of wealth. Right? And what it speaks about is how a community, these are the enemies within, so to speak, right? How how one's family members, that within the Muslim community, within your own household, one's family members, one's wealth, one's attachment to the things of the world, their careers, one's property, one's job, one's gains, one's losses. It's what this indicates, this surah, is that how these things can silently destroy a thriving community of believers, and one wouldn't even notice it because it's coming from a place. So the reason why this is exceptionally scary, why this is so important, and why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highlights it in 2 consecutive surahs, and you find actually a verse of the Quran talking about the fitna of al-amwal wal-awlad repeated at the end of both surahs. But the reason why it's so emphatically highlighted is because it can go unseen, it can go under the radar, right? Because these are 2 things which the love of which comes naturally to the human being: the love of family and the love of wealth, the love of what one has worked for to acquire, and the love of what one has established, which is their own family unit, their spouse, their children. These things the love of these things comes very easily to a person, and so it's very easy to let these things become an obstacle between one and one's path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to thereby be destroyed without even realizing. And so he only highlights these 2 subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we go to the last 2 surahs, which is Surah Al-Talaq and Surah Al-Tahrim, right? And now this shifts now. After speaking about the community at the macro level, which is the ummah level, right? The ummah level is the macro level of the Muslim community. After speaking at that level, this shifts now to these 2 surahs speak only about the family and the family ethic and family relationships. And Surah Al-Tahrim delves into a really deep discussion of some of the dynamics of the prophetic household itself. Alayhi salawatullah. And so in Surah Al-Talaq, it's very interesting. There's 12 verses in Surah Al-Talaq, right? 5 of the 12 verses, and the entire surah is, if you look at the first segment of the surah, there's 2 clear, you can clearly see, anyone who reads with even the most faintly discerning eye, what you'll see is that there's 2 clear segments in the surah. The first part speaking about talaq and the iddah of the woman and how to engage with that difficult situation. But what the surah is actually calling for is adab. And some of the scholars, one of my teachers, in fact, he said that this surah, Surah Al-Talaq, is actually a surah of good etiquette. It's about good character. The entire surah, Imam Biqai also points out this about Surah Al-Tahrim and Surah Al-Talaq. He said that these 2 surahs are calling for al-iltizam bil-adab al-shar'i. What they're calling for is strict adherence, radical adherence to the adab of the sharia, to the adab that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught. And so in 12 short verses, you have the idea of taqwa repeated inside Surah Al-Talaq 8 times, 5 mantuq, 5 explicitly, ittaqullah, wa man yattaqillah, 5 explicitly have been stated 5 times. But then there's 3 or 4 other references, and one of the scholars in fact says it's in every verse of Surah Al-Talaq has a reference to taqwa. And that's because that the family, which is the basic unit of every community, communities are measured in families. The unit of measurement for community is family, right? And if the family is not built on the right premise, then the idea of communities being thriving and flourishing is far-fetched. It's just it's vain, right? It's in vain. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the basis of the Muslim household, the principle of taqwa. He speaks about the idea of ma'ruf and darar. The word ma'ruf, in fact, is repeated 4 times in the surah, right? Which is the idea of goodliness and softness and gentleness in the administration of the affair of the household. And then Surah Al-Tahrim, same thing, right? Surah Al-Tahrim speaks about the teleology of family, right? That there needs to be vision, and there needs to be an objective behind the establishment of family. Why are you getting married? Why are you establishing a household? Why do you want children? What's the objective? Is it just something that we do because, 21 got my degree, 22 landed the job, 23 bank balance looks healthy, now get the wife, right? Is it just because it looks good, or it's because it's time for it, everyone does it at the same time? Or is the objective, is the teleology? And Surah Al-Tahrim actually establishes the teleology of family. And then it goes on to speak about how family is merely a means for serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not the be-all and the end-all, right? So it's not about getting your trophy wife or getting your trophy husband and having your trophy children and then khalas, it all looks really good, the nuclear family and so on. It's what are we doing inside that unit? And is that unit of greatest service to the larger Muslim community, or is it just merely something that we do because it's just from the sunnah of human beings to do, right? And then it goes on to give examples of two households, right? It gives the example of the household of the Prophet Nuh and Lut, alayhi salam, whose wives are not upon the way of the, and this is the point we were trying to make, right? Which is the fact that one's family is ultimately a means to serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if they don't adhere, if they don't abide by the teleology, the objective that one sets for their household, then they're not part of one's family in the spiritual sense. They are metaphysically outcasts, although they're physically part of one's family and they have rights and they must be fulfilled in the law from the Sharia point of view. In the haqiqah, from the eye of haqiqah, they no longer exist as your family, right? And so Allah gives us examples, and then at the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at the end of Surah Al-Tahrim, to end the juz, He gives us the examples of how one can be in a broken family, one can be in a broken marriage, yet that does not stop one from reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And this is what we said, the objective is not the family, it's to reach Allah. And if it means circumventing the family, then one does so, right? And the example that's given is a beautiful example of Sayyidah Asiya, right? Sayyidah Asiya, alayha salam, the wife of Fir'aun, right? And at the end, when she pleads with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in the narration, the Tafsir Ibn Kathir mentions that she was tortured by her husband when he discovered her belief, right? And and this is also an indication of how one's environment and one's brokenness in terms of if one's social setting is broken or it's unsupportive, it doesn't lend itself to one's spiritual life, it's no excuse ultimately, because we have Sayyidah Asiya can be in the house of Fir'aun, the prototype of kufr and oppression, but she can reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so she's in his house and she says, رَبِّ ابْنِ لِي عِنْدَكَ بَيْتًا فِي الْجَنَّةِ وَنَجِّنِي مِنْ فِرْعَوْنَ وَعَمَلِهِ. Right at the end of the surah, verse 11, I think, or 12, she said, 11 in fact, she says, oh Allah, build for me in your nearness, in the midst of that torture and trouble, she's seeking God's nearness. So she says, Ya Allah, in the midst of this torture, this is her plea. Oh Allah, build for me in your nearness a house and free me from the Fir'aun and his amal, which is important, right? Free me not from the person of Fir'aun only, right? Free me from his person, because to be freed from his person is just personal relief for her. But she's not seeking personal relief. What she's seeking is a mending and a changing of ways so that her connections can be truly prophetic. So she disconnects herself, disavows his amal, his way of being, his conduct, right? She says, free me from his conduct and from his way of being and from his person. And she's from amongst the four women, the kummal, in the hadith of al-Bukhari. The Prophet ﷺ said, many men, kamula min al-rijali kathiruna. The Prophet ﷺ said, many amongst the men attained kamal, attained perfection in the spiritual sense. Wa min al-nisa'i arba'a. The Prophet ﷺ said, and from the women, 4. And then he mentions the 4, right? He mentions Sayyidah Asiya, he mentions Sayyidah Maryam, Sayyidah Khadija. And in one narration, he says, wa khairu nisa'iha Fatima, his own daughter, alayhi salam. So those are the surahs. These are the themes they discuss. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into the verses, but inshallah, read these verses and you'll see the themes that we were pointing to, inshallah. And we'll stop there. These surahs, they require a very concentrated. I've never had the tawfiq to actually deliver on these surahs previously. When we did a Quran course previously, and we got to just 27, I think, or 26 at the most. But these surahs require a very close study, because there's a lot going on. And remember what we said is from a different phase now inside the life of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. So alhamdulillah, inshallah, it's been beneficial. Tomorrow we're going to have our dear guest, Shaykh Safiya, is going to be joining us, Shahid. It's the 29th Juz, inshallah. So please spread the word and join in for that, inshallah, too. So we'll stop there. If there's any questions, we'll take questions. Alhamdulillah. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina